Inflation in China is again a top concern, with some worried left unchecked could lead to social unrest. For more on this, I'm joined by Andy Rothman, China macro strategist for CLSA Asia Pacific Markets. Andy, you seem to be pretty confident that there will be no social unrest due to higher food prices. Why is this?
Well, I think the main reason is that income growth here, both in the cities and in the countryside, has been so strong. More than 7% in the cities, adjusted for inflation for the decade, and for the last 5 years in the countryside, that leaves Chinese consumers much better able to deal with higher food prices than consumers in some other countries.
At what point does inflation lead to social unrest?
Well, I think we're a long, long way from that. I remember that CPI is only 4.4% in October, and almost all of it's food, and it's food items that people can adjust for. So I think that the risk of social unrest very, very low for the foreseeable future because of food prices.
How about inflation figures? Some say they're widely underestimated. What's your view on this?
Well, there are a number of issues to look at. One is that the CPI basket in every country is a little bit controversial because it's designed to capture an average, and almost no one is average. And remember, most people in China are still relatively poor rural people. And so for them, their basket is much different than my basket might be living in downtown Shanghai. But I think in terms of what the basket covers, and it's reasonably transparent, I don't think the government is deliberately trying to hide higher inflation.
And for 2011, what's your outlook for inflation, and where do you see some of the biggest inflationary pressures?
I'm really not worried about inflation. To me, the inflation that we're seeing now is not all that high at 4.4%, given the economy is growing at about 10% and nominal wage growth is at least 10%. And almost all of it is being driven by food, and it's being driven by a temporary weather-related shock to supply. Freezes that were a problem for orange trees, flooding that was a problem for vegetables. So this is temporary, and it will moderate as we get into the first half of next year. So I really don't see inflation as a big problem for next year.
And in terms of wage increases, though, what kind of impact does that have on inflation and, again, on food prices?
Well, that too needs to be put into context. We've had extraordinarily high wage growth here. That's why the income growth has been so strong. And a lot of this has been driven not so much by the market, but by the government. The government has been deliberately raising the minimum wage, which applies to a lot of people in China, to keep people happy with the party and to promote consumption. So here in Shanghai, the minimum wage is up more than 100% since China joined the WTO. So if you can also look, though, at inflation here, non-food inflation has been very low. Even the whole CPI for the last 10 years has averaged 2%. So what we've seen is tremendous productivity growth at companies so that they're not having to pass on these higher wages to higher final goods prices. So it really hasn't been very inflationary, and I think that'll continue to be the case.
So what's your outlook for CPI next year, then?
I think CPI next year will be about 4.5%. And again, in an economy that's going to grow at 9, maybe 9.5 next year, where wage growth is going to be about 10%, it's not bad. And in fact, you could argue that 4% inflation in China is better than 1 or 2% inflation in China, given how strong the economy is.
What's your outlook for monetary policy, and what kind of impact does that have on food prices and inflation?
Well, to me, we've had monetary policy playing only a contributing role in inflation. Milton Friedman's argument that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomena had a couple of contingencies to it which don't apply here. The key one is the velocity of money, the number of times that an individual renminbi is used in a transaction. And what we had is at the same time that money supply growth was growing rapidly here, the velocity of money, or the turnover of money, fell really, really sharply. So that basically neutralized the increase in money supply. Also, on a more basic level, we're not seeing an increase in demand for food. People aren't eating more vegetables this year. That's not driving up the vegetable price. It's been bad weather. And if it's a monetary phenomena, how come non-food inflation is so low? So I think that what we'll see from monetary policy is what I would call normalization. We had a big acceleration of monetary policy for the stimulus in 2009, and now that's being brought back down and will be at about normal levels. So look for M2 growth, loan growth to be about what it was in the years before 2009.